Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you're having a restful weekend. I know I said there may not be an episode today, but I managed to find the time, and there are a couple of developments we need to cover before we move into the new week. First up, we move through developments from this week related to energy matters. Analysts are increasingly concerned about falling demand for oil next year caused by an economic slowdown in China, the world's largest crude importer. According to a monthly Energy Information Administration report in the US published on Tuesday, global crude consumption will be about 104.5 million barrels a day in 2025, down 200,000 barrels a day from a previous forecast, cutting next year's projected demand growth rate to 1.6%. The downward revision is driven by concerns that China's economy has been slowing. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, Chinese state media reported the discovery of a major gas field in the South China Sea. The field, called Lingshui 36-1, is estimated to contain more than 100 billion cubic meters of natural gas and is the world's first so-called ultra-shallow gas field in ultra-deep waters. The field has been tested to produce over 10 million cubic meters per day of open-flow natural gas. It is not clear where the exact location of the field is, but it appears to be in the waters southeast of Hainan, China's southernmost island province. Of course, China claims almost the entirety of the South China Sea. It is unclear whether this discovery is in an area also claimed by Vietnam. Disputes and tensions often rise over each other's oil and gas exploration and development attempts in the contested waters. Zhou Xinhuai, president of the massive state-owned China Natural Offshore Oil Corporation, said in a statement this week, quote, "The South China Sea has been a major region for the company to boost natural gas resources and production. The successful testing of the Lingshui 36-1 further expands the resource base for the development of a trillion cubic meters gas region in the South China Sea. The company will continue to step up exploration and development of hydrocarbon resources in the South China Sea and to enhance our capacity of energy supply." End quote. However, as Hong Kong-based the South China Morning Post points out this week, quote, "Developing oil and gas in the South China Sea will likely face diplomatic and political risks from rival claimants. In 2014, the CNOOC's oil rig Ocean Oil 981's operation in the disputed area near the Paracel Islands triggered widespread anti-China protests in Vietnam. Beijing has also tried to stop unilateral oil and gas development in the South China Sea by other countries. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have reportedly disrupted operations of Malaysia's gas projects, and Chinese and Vietnamese vessels have had repeated confrontation over Hanoi's oil drilling operations in the disputed Vanguard Bank in the past several years." End quote. China is the world's largest natural gas importer, with about $64.3 billion spent on 120 million tons of liquefied and pipe gas in 2023. The discovery of major resources would be a boost for the country's energy security. Now, moving from the ocean to the nearby Hainan Island, workers at Linglong 1 are finishing what will become the world's first small modular nuclear reactor built for commercial purposes. This is also part of Beijing's energy security plans, a national fleet of atom-splitting plants that will aim to wean the country off coal and imported fuel. Bloomberg NEF, a research organization used by energy professionals, reports in a note this week that, quote, "The scale and speed of Beijing's crusade is hard to overstate. China approved its first nuclear power station in 1981. We now expect the country to leapfrog France and the US by 2030. In an age when few new reactors are built at all, China has 30 under construction. Beijing has spent billions on research and experiments such as Linglong 1, operated by China National Nuclear Power Co., and the only small modular reactor approved by the International Atomic Energy Agency to date. It's due to be completed by the end of next year. On key hoped-for advantages like fusion, combining rather than breaking apart atoms, Beijing far outspends the US on research and development." End quote. The research note explains that there's no great industrial secret to what China is doing. It's largely a matter of vast scale, state support, and relatively simple, replicable construction. It's a success that could also be transferred abroad, because the appetite for nuclear power is growing thanks to energy security and climate imperatives. That's especially true in the developing world. Francis Morin, China director of the World Nuclear Association, recently observed, quote, "China's pace is something that's truly been unseen anywhere else before," end quote. Beijing ended its hiatus, which was triggered by the Fukushima disaster, for new plants from 2019. Since then, the government has approved 10 reactors in each of the past 2 years to reach its goal of bringing nuclear to 15% of total generation by 2050, enough to make it the third largest source of energy after wind and solar. The US still has the largest fleet, but it's built only 3 reactors in the past decade. China is building and at a much faster rate. The Bloomberg NEF note explains that China has lavished government support on the industry, specifically in expensive financing from state-owned banks. Quote, "That's crucial. Most of the lifetime cost of running a nuclear facility is paying down the construction debt. For example, at 2% interest, about the minimum for infrastructure projects in places like China. Nuclear power costs about $47 per megawatt hour, far cheaper than coal and natural gas in many places. At a 10% rate, the high end of the spectrum, the cost of nuclear power shoots up to almost $100 per megawatt hour, more expensive than just about anything else." End quote. China also prioritizes building several reactors of the same design, creating standardization, the note explains, a ready supply chain and an array of trained workers that avoids cost overruns and delays. Today, China is focused on so-called third-generation reactor design, an older but not too aged technology. Last year, China started commercial operations of the world's first high-temperature gas-cooled reactor, a so-called fourth-generation technology. And in January, China also unveiled a national company designed to speed development of nuclear fusion, officially joining the race to develop nearly limitless carbon-free energy with no danger of a meltdown. Safety remains a serious concern, though. China has a long record of industrial accidents, poor safety standards, and local government cover-ups. A suspected leak at a plant in Taishan near Hong Kong in 2021 shocked international observers at the time. China denied the leak at the time and classified it as a zero-level incident. Next up, the role of technology in Chinese growth. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, as always, it's a huge help if you can hit the like button. Subscribing is also tremendous help for the channel. The last week or so, the channel has not been shown to many new viewers. The algorithm has not been happy, but liking, sharing, and subscribing, about 40% of regular viewers are not subscribed. These things help the algorithm show this to new people and lets the channel grow. Next up, Carnegie Senior Fellow and Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis is a commentator we quote often in China Update. This month, Pettis, in collaboration with several other experts, launched the China Reform Imperative. The China Reform Imperative examines China's economic reforms and their impacts on the global economy. It says it will focus on China's reform trajectory and on challenges and opportunities Beijing faces along the way. To end today, I thought it would be good to examine one of their first articles, published this week, which discusses whether China's technology drive has differentiated China today from Japan in the 1990s. We're now quoting selected excerpts from the piece directly. If China wants to avoid repeating the long, difficult economic adjustment Japan suffered after 1990, it is important that Chinese policymakers understand what happened in Japan in the 1980s and 1990s and why the country's adjustment was so difficult. In recent years, some analysts have argued that China will not repeat Japan's travails because of Beijing's focus on developing new technology. Japan, they claim, did little to resolve its problem of weak domestic demand, whereas China will manage it with technological breakthroughs that will boost domestic demand through increases in productivity. One of the proponents of this view is Lin Yifu, Peking University professor and former chief economist at the World Bank. For example, in a recent interview with the South China Morning Post, he said, "What about it? After the 1980s, which world-leading industries were invented by Japan? Japan's economic development stagnated because it gave up on industrial policy to incubate new industries. But China did not do that, so China will continue to develop." As an aside, we covered this interview last week on China Update. We continue with the article. This may be wishful thinking. The claim that Japan stagnated because it abandoned an industrial policy designed to develop highly advanced new technologies is hard to square with Japanese history. In fact, most economic historians would argue that Tokyo, in the late 1980s and 1990s, like Beijing today, found it politically difficult to address its deep demand-side imbalances and instead hoped to accelerate supply-side reforms by focusing on the development of new technology. At the time, Tokyo expected that technological advancement would lead to large enough technological breakthroughs and productivity gains for the overall economy that Japan would be able to rebalance its economy towards a greater role for domestic demand without slowing the growth on the supply side. It would be growth in supply that would drive even faster growth in demand. In fact, Japan's technological push was quite successful. It maintained and even expanded its technological lead in many of the most important industries of the 1990s. For example, economist Noah Smith, in response to Lin's claims, pointed out that in the period after 1990, Japan created the digital camera industry, 3G, camera phones, the lithium-ion battery industry, the hybrid car industry, service robots, and high-performance ceramics. Japan's strategy of expanding industrial policy directed at advanced technology was well recognized at the time. An April 1986 memorandum prepared by the CIA's Office of East Asian Analysis with the title Attacking Japan's Saving Investment Imbalance, Structural Adjustment versus Fiscal Stimulus, reported the following. Despite the nod this week's Maekawa Commission report gives to structural adjustment, i.e. to policies to expand domestic demand, Tokyo largely sees this concept as a version of industrial policy designed to encourage economic shifts, such as phasing out of depressed industries and development of technologically advanced ones, and will enhance long-run competitiveness. The memo noted that rather than implement policies to shift income distribution in favor of raising domestic demand, Tokyo was instead focusing on increasing its international competitiveness by shifting toward what at the time were considered the leading new global technologies, many of which Japan continued to dominate for years. 5 months later, in another memorandum, the Office of East Asian Analysis noted that the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry is engaged in an industrial restructuring program designed to phase out uncompetitive segments of the steel and textile industries and to shift the resources to more productive sectors. These moves are designed to enhance international competitiveness rather than encourage firms to focus on the domestic market. The memo continued. On balance, these steps will probably do more to enhance Japan's international competitiveness than to reduce its trade surplus. Measures likely to expand domestic spending show little sign of being implemented soon. Japan, in other words, did precisely what Lin and others say it didn't do. What is striking is not that Beijing today is attempting a radically different solution to its economic imbalances than Tokyo's attempted solution in the late 1980s and early 1990s, but rather how similar its response so far has been to Tokyo's. For Japan at the time, while domestic and foreign economists called for measures to expand domestic consumption by directly or indirectly boosting the household income share of gross domestic product, Tokyo worried that this was the wrong way to address the problem of weak domestic demand. It instead implemented more aggressive supply-side measures designed to boost international competitiveness. In the end, supply-side policies failed to drive both rebalancing and rapid growth. The consumption share of Japan's GDP bottomed out at 63.3% in 1991, compared to 53.4% for Japan in 2022. And it took 17 years for the consumption share to rise by 10 percentage points. In 2008, it had reached 73.8%, still below the global average. During that time, Japan's share of global GDP dropped from 15% to 7.9%. I am not arguing that an intense supply-side focus on developing new technology won't make a difference for China and will fail. It is certainly possible that such a focus could help China avoid, or at least reduce, a long and difficult adjustment associated with boosting a very weak demand side of the economy. But it is foolish to suggest that such a focus must inevitably work, and even more foolish to claim that China is the first country to try this approach. Many countries have tried to resolve demand imbalances with technology-driven supply-side measures, most notoriously the Soviet Union in the 1960s and Japan in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But it has always proved far more difficult than expected. The important lesson is that ignoring the problems of its historical precedents won't make China's success any more likely. Here ends the direct quote and today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a lovely weekend, a restful weekend, and I will see you all for another week of China Update on Monday.